Welcome everyone. In today's sessions we're going to be talking a bit about interactive narrative, how we can design it to better fit our video games. So without further ado, let's start with the concept of narrative itself. Now this is a concept that has a lot of polemic and a lot of discussion around it. I like Porter Abbott's definition, and it's sort of what I'm going to go with. And the first part of it, sort of paraphrasing what he said, is the narrative is a sequence of events, what we usually understand as a story. So a very interesting thing that this part of the definition can be correlated with video games is with the core main game loop, which basically is a tool that is very recurrent that we use in design to define the actions that the player is repeatedly taking to progress through the game. So one very, very common example is in Hollow Knight, in which you arrive into a new place, you find a safe zone, and then you progress, tension starts spiking, you reach a middle save point, which can also be a checkpoint for the case, and then you progress further into the zone, finally reaching a climax, usually in the form of a boss, and then you find relief, and you basically have your classic tension chart, right? So under this view, it is easy to think that, oh yeah, okay, it makes sense, games are narratives because there's a sequence of events, there's a story being told, and in fact, games are usually understood under such lens. But of course, you'd be hard-pressed to find someone who says that, yeah, fighting games, for example, are an actual narrative. Which is weird because there are a lot of cases of fighting games that do sprout stories that get very well known. In this case, for example, Evo Moment 37 is a classic among classics. And in fact, those stories emerging is just the result of the mechanics that the designers planned to generate these kind of stories, in a similar way in which the emergent narrative is a concept that is based on setting some building blocks and then forcing the player to use them in a certain way that generates interesting stories. Fighting games are basically the same concept. In this case, the idea of the chip damage mechanic or system and the idea of the parry mechanic, combining those two things, basically is setting the playground for the kind of moment that Evo Moment 37 was to happen. And yet again, most people don't really think of fighting games as narrative stories. Similar example, and even more evident, would be Tetris. Even though there has been the most, and in fact the reason why I put this example is because Janet Murray in her book Hamlet in the Holodeck did analyze Tetris and did explain Tetris from a narrative perspective. But the thing is that people just don't really have this view when playing Tetris. And this is a problem that we're going to talk about, how every game in fact can be understood as narrative. But before we do that, let's see this animation. So, with this animation, it was basically a proof of concept that human beings tend to see stories no matter how abstract the presentation of those stories are. However, if we look at these, which is a very simple case, but then look at Tetris, which is somewhat more complex, the way in which both movement pieces are approached by the public are completely different. Tetris is usually not understood as narrative. And that is because of the second part that we have of our narrative, which is discourse, the mannerisms with which we are explaining a story. And so in the case of this animation, there wasn't really anything else but the animation. So it was easy for the player to feel like they had to, for the viewer, it was easy for them to feel that they had to derive some kind of idea, that there was something behind it. In the case of Tetris, however, that wasn't the case, because games are naturally interactive. So interactivity essentially is a way in which we can occupy our attention, which is of course a limited resource. So when we're putting attention into taking decisions of where to go, what set do I want to use, what weapon I want to have, what is the best path to take, when we're executing some kind of action, because at the end of the day, pressing buttons, especially as the complexity goes higher, also requires attention. And of course, being within an environment, understanding what surrounds you and deriving information so that you can take those decisions more appropriately, all of those things require you to pay attention. And so, because you're already doing something and you're in a way saturated, you don't have resources to spend on thinking of what you're living through as a story. Why does this happen though? Very easily because games are a machine of states that need continuous progression. From the beginning to the end, the player is the one who is causing this progression. And the thing is, because failed states exist, or at least states that hinder the progression of the player, there is a reluctance on letting that happen. The player wants to progress or improve the rate at which they are progressing, to a certain degree, of course. And so there is a prioritization of their well-being, because failing, dying in the game, means that they have to go back and they have to go through something they have already experienced that is not really interesting anymore. It's a source of frustration. So as long as interactivity has this power and that story cannot compete over that, then games will not necessarily not be perceived as stories, because if it is very obvious, then they will be seen as stories, but they will not really be considered or felt as stories. And so we jump into interactive narrative, which we consider to be any kind of narrative that is in an interactive context. Because at the end of the day, just the fact that you're in an interactive context means that interactivity is going to require, or at least usually, your attention in order to prevent lack of progression. And so this competition between what needs more attention between interactivity and story or narrative is what we call, or at least the property I use to measure this is integration. So to put a bit more of an example on this, we can take this same animation that we just saw and imagine that we as the players have the control of the small triangle and that we can move and we can attack. Those are the mechanics we're working with. So if we add something like audios or any kind of narrative context that is directly telling the player, yes, a story is happening here, then it's much easier that the player thinks and acts upon this context as a story. However, if we take exactly the same situation and we just add things like health bars, what the player is seeing is, oh, there's a win condition, there's a lose condition. Thus, this becomes a purely interactive context. There's no narrative being considered, even though the key elements are exactly the same. So, with that being explained, let's talk a bit about levels of integration. The only real meaningful distinction I make here is between null and low and medium and high, as we're going to see later, but sort of to explain what this exactly means. So, for games that have a null level of integration, or that I consider so, we would have something like Celeste. Now, don't get me wrong, Celeste has a really good narrative. The whole metaphor of Manta and how it treats ideas of depression, I really like Celeste and its story. However, in terms of integration, in terms of how much the player is considering the story when they are taking decisions, well, it doesn't happen really in Celeste. You have the story, and then the story shuts down, and they present you with interactivity. You simply play the game, and then interactivity shuts down, and they present you the story again. There is a certain point in which those two things do kind of overlap, but for the most part, Celeste has absolutely no integration. Another example, Breath of the Wild, right? In this game, even though it does have a very prominent and very direct story, I would consider it has very low integration. Because you get out of the plateau, and you're not immediately thinking, oh man, I gotta go save Zelda, and I gotta like become more powerful because, oh my god, the world is going into end or something. No, you're just like, wow, this world is like fully explorable, are you kidding me? And then after you've played for 500 hours, maybe then you start remembering that you had something to do with the story or something, right? So even though there's constant story being fed and there are quests and there's a lot of narrative content, the level of integration of Breath of the Wild is really low. So when we make considerations about those games, we make those that are relevant to an interactive context, but not to a highly integrated one. So, a very important factors to consider in this case would be things like the classical narrative principles that I'm not really going to discuss here because these things should be like more than known if you are even desiring in any degree to like do narrative. Those are like the basic blocks of narrative, and I'm not going to explain those. But important. Let's go back to topic. Integration, mid-high level. What do we consider those things? I would say so would be Undertale, for example. And I think Undertale is a very interesting example because there are a lot of choices, passive choices, that the game doesn't directly address to the player, but which do have consequences. But the thing that Undertale has is that the player doesn't even think. Like, it's not so much that the game asks them or lets their choices define what the decision has been, but the player doesn't even see that there is a decision because of all the notions that RPGs have about how the player interacts with the enemies. However, Toby Fox, who is very smart guy, he was like, I can still make the player think about the narrative and desire interaction with the narrative by filling the world with a lot of mini events and with a lot of interactions that are interesting on a narrative level. So, for example, I guess the snowman would be like one of the earliest, more clear examples. So even though the player doesn't really think a lot about choices they are making in terms of changing the results of the story, even though they are happening, they are thinking a lot about what can be the next narrative piece that they are going to find and where should they go to find these small rewards. Right, so I would consider that to be mid-level because, as I said, they are not really thinking that what they are doing is going to have an effect or is going to unravel something about the narrative, but it's enough to have it in consideration as they play. Another example, Fallout New Vegas. This is like high top-tier integration level. Like, you can play this game as if you were playing a role-playing game. Like, not an RPG, like an actual like classic Dungeons and Dragons. It's like, it works. You don't even have to think of this as a video game. It's just like you're playing a narrative, literally. It's, in my experience, the game that most closest resembles this idea of just playing a narrative. So for these things, we do have to consider the decision-making process of the player considering the narrative within the interactivity. Finally, then we come to the point of integration. Okay, why integration? Why does this matter anyway? Well, very simple. Games that I consider to be null to low integration, those in which the player is not thinking about how they can influence the story, or they can relate or interact with the story, which I would say that is a more passive experience. Those kind of games are simply experienced as an observation, which, again, is totally fine. Most of stories that human beings have been telling from the beginning of times have been this way. Just someone tells you something, and then you hope that this person has enough empathy or enough of an experience to relate to what you're explaining that they will come to like the story, right? This is a very obvious case when you go see a classic of some kind of media, and you have developed enough taste within the media to be able to appreciate all of its facets. Yet you go out of seeing that classic and you're like, well, I mean, it was well done. I can appreciate the polish it has, but I didn't really feel it because it's not something that appeals to you as a human being. So those kind of experiences have this type of limitation. For something like a very personal story, something that is difficult to convey through interactivity, like is the case with Celeste and how it treats depression, it's hard to put that into a game system and make it work and make it so that the player wants to keep experiencing that. So for cases like these, it's much better to just have a passive story in which the player just receives the information and can empathize, and that's enough. Then you have other cases like Breath of the Wild, which, let's be honest, it has a story because, I mean, it's a Zelda, so it has to have a story. But if it didn't, though, like, I don't really think many people would complain, because Breath of the Wild, first and foremost, and I'm not saying the story is bad, I'm just saying that first and foremost, what this game is about is interaction. It's about emergent play, right? So, for these kind of games, not really necessary. Again, in design, there's not really correct and incorrect decisions. It's just how the experience you use as your focal point describes different decisions as more adequate or inadequate, right? So, in the other side, for the medium to high integration levels of narrative, which again, this distinction is not a specific point, it's a continuous spectrum, right? But for those cases in which we think that the experience can be better achieved when the player is constantly thinking about the narrative state when they are taking decisions, well, games in which such experience can be felt viscerally, can be something that is experienced firsthand by the player, those kind of experiences, and which of course rely on narrative, much more benefit from a narrative integration. Those are the games in which high levels of integration should be considered to be implemented. Essentially because what you are achieving by doing that is that you're creating the resonance. You don't have to hope that the other person sees what you're presenting and relates to it. They are literally feeling what you are presenting, and by making a story about that, they get to experience firsthand. It's much more easier to reach that human core that, again, most experiences aim to find. So, having defined why to use integration and in which cases to choose integration, let's actually talk about how to do it. Principles. We're going to talk both about integration and about just general interactive narrative principles. This is not going to be about how to integrate, well, let me put the next slide, yeah. It's not going to be about how to integrate something within the context of interactivity. We're just going to focus on narrative, because of course there's a lot more thing. There's how smoothly do you deliver information, how you generate and manage the expectations that you're creating on the player. So even within the realm of narrative, like there's so much more than we're going to talk about here. For this session, we're just going to be about how can you trample with both integration related context and with presentation of narrative in the interactive context. So again, we're going to talk about concepts, but not about how to implement them in the better way. Mostly because that's a very specific topic, but also because I just don't have the time to do that right now. We're also not going to talk about how to integrate these for pipelines in general. Each has its own specificities. And again, I'm just here to explain concepts that in the community of interactive narrative, they are not really very explored. Because in that community, we tend to be more like freeform, and everyone has sort of their own view, which is sort of what happens with video games in general. So I'm just trying to put some order here. So to go forth, before we enter the whole principle thing, I would like to put hypothetic, because I'm gonna start sending a lot of information, and of course, these being a YouTube video, you will hardly be able to very directly communicate with me. I think you should be able to write comments. I don't know if I have them enabled. They should. So in order to sort of exemplify and try to make it clear for everyone, let's put a hypothetical, right? So imagine this is a 3D action game, classic, be a Witcher or Dark Souls, for example. And so you're controlling your avatar, and your objective, your current narrative objective, is to get closer with the monarchy, because they have some privileges that can help you with a personal quest that you have taken, whatever. And so this nation that you are in has a national treasure. How convenient. And it has been stolen by a thief, a band of thieves, and they have taken it to their lair, right? And once you kill the leader of those thieves, you get a quest to do so, and then you get a map. And by killing him, you get the map, you find the layer, you recover the treasure, thus the narrative continues. Whatever. In this hypothetical, I would say that we have a relatively low integration. The player is not really thinking about what they are doing. They just get the quest, get the map. Once the quest is done, progress. No brain cells needed to do any of this, right? So let's now begin with the principles and see how we can apply them to this example. So, for our first case, for the first principle, perspective of narrative alteration. This basically means that the player, in the context that they are while they're playing, they must think that there exists the possibility that their actions affect the narrative in some way. So, a clear example of when this doesn't happen is when text such as mission start or race begin or whatever appears. So, a very simple way to exemplify this is if they tell you you have to participate in a car race, and then there's a fade to black, and then you appear on the car, and there's a countdown, and then, the race starts. If they had to ask you whether throwing a character out of the stage, of the track, would sort of have consequences, and wouldn't just be like disqualifying them from the race, I feel like most people in this situation would say, no, it doesn't. However, if they tell you that you have to participate on a race, and then what you have to do is go to your car and get into your car, and you know that from before, acting in the world has changes. This continuity into going into the race, I would think that most people would think, oh, if I crash against someone and put them out of the track, this is going to be remembered. This is going to have consequences going on. So, in summary, perspective of narrative alteration, then, is the idea that the least the player is able to discern whether their actions have narrative or their context in which they are can have narrative consequences or not, the more immersed the player will be in the narrative. Because it will be worth for them considering constantly at every moment in which they are within the context whether their actions are going to have consequences or not. The moment in which they realize that for a certain context they can do whatever and it doesn't matter, they can just stop thinking. It's not worth it because it doesn't have any meaningfulness. So an example that I really like for this would be this clip of Elden Ring.
Wait, please! I surrender! White flag and all! Well, finally come round, have you? I knew you would. You're a man of reason. True and true.
So this is an interesting case because it lets me point out a couple of things. So first of all, the player enters this and they see the boss bar and they're like, okay, immediate interactive mode. What I have to do is defeat this boss and then get the rewards. Even if it's patches. And again, admittedly, many people might feel a bit preoccupied of whether killing patches is not actually going to kill them or not. If it weren't, I would argue that it wouldn't be impossible to think that some players would be like, oh, I just have to kill the character and then they actually will not have died and I can interact them in some other way. But in this case, the player goes in full, okay, gotta kill the Elden Ring boss, there's a health bar, And then after a certain threshold is passed, they do something similar as what I presented before. So like they add a very clear audio of like surrender. I literally surrender. The guy pulls up his shield. There's a very clear animation telling him, telling the player that they have possibility to act upon the narrative. So in this case, it sort of does the opposite of what we were saying. Instead of making sure that the player cannot separate between the interactive context and the narrative context, to put some quotes on that, they are breaking the interactive context, or the context in which the player is focusing their attention on interaction, and they are forcing the narrative to be at the same level. Again, we can avoid this by simply never letting the player make that distinction, but it's also an interesting case because the cases that I mentioned always used the extra diegetical elements, the UI, as sort of signals of what is interactive moment, what is narrative moment. In this case, again, we do have a helper that serves to indicate an objective to the player, but at the same time, that doesn't necessarily have to be opposite to having narrative elements, or for the player to perceive that their actions can have narrative implications. So, on to the second principle, action initiative. Now, it's gonna be crazy. It's about the initiative of the player to take action. Yeah, very creative name. However, there is an important distinction in the idea of liberty, the freedom that the player has to take the decision, not the freedom to affect the decision. So if you go to a player and you tell them A or B, that's not the same as letting the player reach something and then thinking, I want to do X because, or onto, or in regards to this thing. So this distinction is important because, again, returning to our definition of integration, it means that the player is considering, is thinking about what they want to do and how they want to affect the world, and they are being engaged by the narrative elements. The moment in which you have a story that passively asks you to choose between one or the other, your brain just shuts off. It doesn't need to worry about the narrative. Allegedly, you have to pay attention at the very least to make the decision, but you don't have to worry about acting in any quote-unquote bad way until you get to that decision, because you know the changes, you know the consequences will only come from that decision that you know will be clearly presented to you directly. So, action initiative, very powerful, because it lets us give agency to the player. The player is the one who is choosing when to act, how to act, upon who to act. And additionally, the player also gets a sense of anticipation that comes much further from when the choice is given, because they are the ones deciding, I want to do that. And then all the process until they get where they have to in order to do something, all of that is anticipation that you're building. If you just give a passive option, the anticipation, the tension doesn't start building until you're presenting that indeed there is an option to choose from. However, of course, we can't expect the player to be magical beings that just find the interesting context without any particular reason. So we have a couple of things that we should consider. For example, techniques of player guidance. Now, the most classic are environmental things, for example, landmarks or the illumination of the scene, how elements are disposed, the composition of the scene. There's a lot of environmental tricks that can be used, but it doesn't have to be limited to that. The way you deliver information, for example, can also help the player to be guided towards interesting things, as long as they have to still think about what you are presenting to them. In fact, a reason why I don't really like landmarks is precisely because of that. It's like having a quest marker that tells you, oh, here's an interesting place, even though it is much more subtle than having an actual quest marker that tells you to go there. Something that we should not do if we want to keep the initiative of the player is precisely this marvelous example. It was not what I was going to go for, but I just saw it and was like, we're here for no reason and we'll disappear for no reason. And this is a problem, of course, because while it's not exactly telling the player when to act, it's telling the player how to not act. So essentially, it functions in the same way. If, however, we have to have this kind of content, because sometimes you have defined a gameplay progression that requires to lock certain parts of the map at certain points, what you should do is narratively justify these. I cannot go through these because I have to solve this problem. In this case, it's like, okay, what impedes me from just... I mean, of course, in the game you can do it, but logically you could just ask them politely to let you pass, and you should be able to do that. But of course, the game doesn't allow that. If, for example, it was a case of, oh, the train that gets you to the next place has run out of electricity, so you, kid that is 10 years old, should go fix the power plant, because that makes a lot more sense, right? That is better than just forcing the player to move somewhere else, because at least you're giving a justification, right? Pretty self-evident. I don't think I have to explain this any further. A final thing to consider, though, is that if we rely on our game to be moved by the initiative of the player, we have to consider secrets, the level of secrecy with which something is presented. So, for example, Gwyndolin from Dark Souls, he's a boss that is not very easy to reach. In fact, most players do not find him, because you have to be kind of a bad person or bad character to find him, or else have an extreme luck by equipping a certain item. That's just... I don't think it's very reasonable to expect the player to do that. So basically, if the opportunities we give to the player to take the initiative are so obscure and so difficult to reach that the player will not even try, or they will not even be aware that such is a possibility, then we don't have a game of high initiative. We have to consider to what degree we'll let the player take such decisions. On to the next one. Meaningful response. Well, pretty self-evident. When you act upon something or someone, this agent should react in a way that is according to however you have acted. The more specific that response, the more the player will feel like immersed, because it makes sense. But most importantly, the degree at which that action is changing the status of the player. How the player has to reconsider the situation because of the consequences they have been presented with. If the consequence is just interesting purely on a narrative level, well, that's also valid. But if every situation yields consequences that just inform you without changing the perspective you have on the world or the path you are going to take on your actions, then they are not very meaningful. They are just fine responses. And in that same vein, world responsiveness. It's not just that the agents you act upon can answer to your actions, but that the entire world can do so. And now, this can be something as simple as you have 4 brothers in the same room, and you punch one of them, and then the other 3, well, retaliate back. Most obvious case. But it can also be extra contextual. So you do something in one context, and then you go to another one, and someone has heard of your actions, and then acts accordingly, acts differently because you have caused action. And then you have a final consideration to be made, which is the time context. So basically, if you have acted upon an agent, the response doesn't have to be immediate. You can hold the response to those actions and give them at an appropriate moment. And those are sort of the 3 dimensions that you should consider when designing world responsiveness. Again, those things are basically for the sake of interaction, but for interaction of immersion. But most importantly, to keep the player guessing, to keep the player, and more importantly also in this case, to have them pay attention. Because if you know that contexts are not self-contained, it will be important for you to relate, to understand the relationships between the different agents, to know what allegiances you should be playing with and which you should be keeping safe or stable. So, returning to our hypothetic, just to refresh a bit minds, You have a quest to kill the bandit, the leader of a group of bandits. Once you've killed them, you get a map, and you can go to their hideout and get the national treasure they have stolen back. Okay, great. How do we make these high integration? Well, one of the many approaches that could be taken, I've been thinking of, could be, for example, of course, we have the initial and final point. Don't give a quest, right? Which doesn't mean that this encounter has to be random or has to be by chance by the player going into a certain area. You can still force the encounter, but just give information, right? Say, hey, there's this guy who's stolen the national treasure, sort of making a big ruckus about it. Okay, then the player can just go somewhere and find this guy, or literally something as simple as if player goes out of town, which doesn't even have to be in a specific place, doesn't have to be like a collision detection, then you trigger the event. But if the player really is interested in this and they want to better prepare themselves for the fight, they can go around and ask, oh, well, not necessarily directly ask, but gather information about this. So what kind of weapon do they use? How many people are there? What kind of group it is, right? I think that's much more interesting than just giving a quest with a lot of detail. And then again, the quality of information might be the same. That it doesn't have to differ. It's just how the player interacts and how they can acquire worthy information without just having to do nothing. So another idea I had is instead, and this, fair enough, it's sort of the same that Elden Ring did with patches, so maybe saying it's my idea, you know. But whatever, I thought about this before I thought about patches, okay, so it's my idea. Designers be like. So, instead of you kill assassin and you get the map, once assassin gets under a certain threshold, well, I call him assassin because he's from Fate, he's called assassin, whatever. So once the leader of the thieves reaches a certain threshold, they start running away back to their hideout, right? And if the player can kill them, you can just take their greatsword and bong them from behind, just, you know, finish the job. But they can also be like, oh, well, I've been gathering information and I'm aware that this band of thieves has a sort of very familiar relationship, and, you know, the way they work. I know they are going to send someone to help this guy, so if I just wait, I can pursue him and then get to their lair, right? And now again, this doesn't mean that you don't get a map if you beat him, because just because you want the player to take the interesting option, it doesn't mean that you should gatekeep any player that just decide to be more direct, right? But in this hypothetical, the player is like, oh, I'm going to just wait, follow him from behind. Of course, like, you could have a system that has like character detection, so if assassin doesn't see, like, if they see you, they're not just gonna go back to their hideout like YOLO, right? They're gonna try to divert their path and sort of lose you in this persecution. They might shoot distant attacks, whatever. In this case, however, some of the thieves go as come as reinforcements, and then you deal with them. You could even like add a whole subplot here in which like they were acting under the leader's influence, but they weren't really into the whole being thieves thing, and then like you can just expand this. But even in the simple case of they just try to stop you, and then you kill them, and then you finally pursue this guy, you reach the lair, and you can, you know, recover the national treasure, whatever. It's essentially the same thing, but the player is much more involved in the story because they have to think about how they want to approach the story and how their approach is going to have consequences, and it's going to change. And again, essentially, the narrative has not changed, because the leader of thieves is going to die sooner or later. So you can say there's a minor divergence, but it's not something that is causing any kind of stress in the development of the game. It's just character behavior and whether the guy is dead or not. But again, much better integration. The player is feeling what it is to fulfill this quest instead of just pressing buttons. However, this is not everything that we can do. Not all the principles of integration. So let's overview the few more that we still have left. So for example, Context facilitation. This is the idea that the player not only has to be able to find the information to take those decisions, but similarly to what I said about how the player would want to gather information to prepare for the quest, this would only happen if the player had the expectation that, yes, preparing myself for this fight is actually possible. The game enables me the preparation. It lets me find information. It gives worth to the process of trying to understand the world. So another example would be, for example, amazing phrasing there. If you reach some kind of secret tower that you haven't, it has like a mystic aura to it, and you know that these places in whatever game you're playing are usually quite dangerous. And so you're looking at the tower and thinking, should I go in or should I not? And regardless of whether you're in a situation in which you have very precious resources or where you can just afford to die a couple of times, if you know that the world is going to reward you with information, with being prepared, it's going to be much better for you to take that decision of, okay, I consider the narrative context and I decide that it's better for me to prepare myself or not. However, if we're just discussing, do I lose a lot of resources if I go in or not, then the story has no weight in this decision. So in here we're taking this, and again, it doesn't have to be everything about extra diegetic content. Like, you can have extra diegetic, for example, a quest diary or something, or a quest book, I mean, and still be correctly or highly integrated. All right. It's this balance between how easily you're delivering information to the player and how big the effort they have to do to get that information is. Because again, if it's too high, we go back to the idea of the secrecy. The player might expect that, yes, such information exists, but to get it, it might take like 3 hours. I'm not willing to spend 3 hours to possibly get some information when I could just get into the tower. But at the same time, if you just have registered that, oh yeah, this tower is la 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 la, and then you complete it by doing la 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 la, and it's like, not a lot of proactiveness there. Further things, action range. Well, again, unsurprisingly, action range is the range of actions you have available here. What does this mean? So, if you have a character that has, like, for example, 4 ways to punch you in the face, or kick you in the face, whatever, the considerations that the player is doing in terms of how their actions interact with the environment is only one. How does this agent react to me punching them in the face? Even though, of course, you have 4 actions. So it's much better to have diversity here. So, for example, being able to taunt someone, being able to be a drama queen, or being able to invite someone to take jogs the morning with you. I don't know. Like, any diversity that you get is going to be a positive, because it's gonna have the player more engaged. They're gonna have to spend more attention into thinking how they can act and what consequences they could possibly get. However, this is also good because players do not all have the same perspective. They don't all have the same motivation. So if you just present a single array of tools that ultimately fulfill the same purpose, and the player is not really keen into exercising that kind of action, they're not going to be very motivated, even if you can have a lot of content to offer them. By giving them different handles from which to approach the narrative, you get to motivate players and more easily get them into the narrative. And finally, we have contingency measures. It basically englobes everything that allows the player to take back their decisions. The classicest example is saving your game, right? You save and then you quit the game when something bad happens, and then you reload your prior game and nothing has happened. There has been no consequences for your actions. The easiest to abuse these kind of systems, the least tension there will be, because you know that it doesn't matter if you fail. Again, there can be a certain level of tension from how the information is presented, how the context is lived through, but narratively, there's not gonna be any feeling of tension because you can just save and then go back. Again, interactivity is its own thing. Dark Souls bosses are like a clear example. They are difficult, well, quote unquote. They can feel very difficult, and so even if it doesn't have a lot of narrative change, being able to reach a certain point, to pass a certain threshold is important, yada yada, but I think that's pretty self-evident. An example I like to put in this situation is, for example, Vestaria Saga. Again, a lot of exampling. In this game, which is a tactical RPG turn-based thing, basically, it's Fire Emblem. It's from Shozo Kaga, the creator of Thracia 776, which, you know, best game ever. So in this game, you can only save every 5 turns, right? So while it is still giving you the leniency to be able to save your progress as you progress in the map, again, phrasing amazing, you still have a limitation. So the way in which you're going to take decisions is going to be very tied to at what point you did save. And this can lead to situations which you have to take a decision seriously, because no way in hell I'm redoing the last 5 turns, right? And this is not really the only way to do it. There are games that have save systems that go through resources. So basically, even if the resource, the ratio at which the resources are given to the player is not terribly bad, just the notion that there's a chance to run out of them, just that tension already makes the player perceive the decision they are taking much more tensely. And they take it much more seriously. However, there are other ways in which you can revert the state of your narrative diegesis, which, for example, again, Dark Souls, because I clearly have a lot of diverse games from which to draw reference. The Pardoner, right? This is a character that is... I know it's in the first and second game. I know it's in Elden Ring. Not so sure if it's in the third game. Which basically, once you have aggroed, once an enemy has turned aggressive against you, you can go to the Pardoner, pay them some amount of resources, and then that initial NPC will become pacific with you. I don't really like this system because it very easily negates everything that you do in regards of NPC interaction, but it is true that the cost of what you do goes higher the higher your level is, to a point that you end up spending a lot of souls. It's also true that because this is Dark Souls and it's obtuse like nothing else, it's not really clear what this guy is actually doing, so you might not even be aware that this is actually a way to revert NPC state. And also because it's a fantasy setting, even though it's not very justified in Dark Souls, you can sort of understand that's like, yeah, it sort of makes sense. Regardless, the reason why I take these into commentary, it's because we have to be aware of the implications of having these kind of systems. Because it's not, like I said, it's not just saving the game that can deflate tension. And finally, things like bad ends. Again, this is very usual in visual novels, which like people don't even consider seriously, sadly, in a lot of design circles. But this includes anything that is a game over or any alternative ending. Basically, anytime that you're giving something, some kind of conclusion to the player that just is conclusive but not satisfying, the player is not really gonna like it. And most of the times, these kind of conclusions just mean that the player has to go back and pick the other option, or just do something else. And even if you're giving conclusion and sort of making a point of why the game ends here if you make this choice, ultimately it deflates integration. Because what you have is a situation in which you don't have to worry about the consequences of your actions. Because it's like, if you choose poorly and your main character dies, and it just moves you back, and it tells you, well, choose the other option. Essentially, you have a safe net. Sure, it's frustrating, which is definitely not helping, but there's never anything to quote-unquote worry about when you're taking a choice. Because ultimately, the result is always going to be the good one, by necessity. So, with that, we conclude the principles of integration. And now we can go into the principles of non-integration. Those are the ones that are relative to interactivity as a whole. How do we integrate narrative in an interactive context, regardless of low-high integration? So this is much more generalist, but also much more applicable. For example, parallel growth. So this is a bit of cheating, because this is more of a technique than it is a principle, but it has Thracia 776, so I had to speak about it. It's a rule on my channel, basically. So, what is it? Well, when you're playing a game, you are developing some kind of skill. You're learning a skill set. If you already knew how the game was played, I'm not going to say it would become boring, but it would definitely be a different experience. You would definitely approach it differently. So, if in that game you have a character that is developing those skills, and those skills are the same as the ones that the player are developing, and they progress in a similar rate, and the story is about how this development happens, you basically get the same effect that I was talking that integration has, in which the player gets to live first person the experience, so it resonates much easily with them. But in this case, you're making the story about that progression. So everything that happens basically is trying to say something about that development that the player is going through, which emphasizes, reinforces that visceral sensation of feeling something new even more. And I present Thracia 776 as a prime example of this, because, you know, there are games that do this. It's not something unique to 776. For example, Pokemon is like super classic example. The boom of Pokemon happened on a, I'm not going to say only because, but to a certain degree, because players had never played that game. Obviously, it was the first of the franchise. And so they were discovering, especially a lot of players were of a younger age, right? So they felt this challenge that was of considerable difficulty, and they experienced the journey of becoming a Pokemon master, right? And so that just generated this high emotionality towards the experience that was given to them. This is very easily reasoned by saying, oh, it's because they are playing an avatar, right? They can project into the experience. And while that's true, Thracia 776 is an interesting example, because Leaf is not an avatar. I'm not going to say he's the most developed character in the history of video games, but he has a personality and he takes decisions by himself. The point, again, here is not about integration. It's about this dual development, how the story comments on it. So in this case, again, I said, Thracia, a good example. Let's go to the next one. It's not too complicated, I hope. And again, really simple concept of narrative consonants. Well, I don't know in the English community how much of a meme this concept is. In the Spanish one, it's considerably big because of a certain influenced diascript. But basically, the narrative consonants is that what the narrative of the game is telling you and what the play space of the game is telling you actually overlaps, that it makes sense, that it is the same thing. So the latest, most famous example of this, I think it was The Last of Us, which I think the protagonist is called Nathan Drake. Don't quote me on that, I'm not played the games yet. But basically he's supposed to be like a pacifist and spends all the game shooting to people, right? So that's a dissonance there. And we usually see this kind of dissonance as the whole of what narrative dissonance can be, but it's not really true. That's just intrinsic, an intrinsic source of dissonance. Because you can have an extrinsic one too, which is basically you give a narrative context and then you give a series of actions to the player, and the player actively decides to sabotage whatever context you have set up. So for an intrinsic source, well, it's usually as simple as being aware of what the game is about and not bullying your narrative designers, because unfortunately that's something that happens and thus has consequences. But for an extrinsic source of dissonance, it's much more difficult. A thing that you can do is to limit the amount of actions that you give to the player in each context. Again, pairing this up with high integration can be kind of weird, but generally that's an option you have. You can also sort of punish the player or try to influence the player to taking certain decisions, and then hope that these dissonance will not be generated because the player will be more moved towards taking certain decisions that are consonant with the narrative. Or alternatively, you can accept any input and then retroactively justify why the player did something, even if at first hand it could seem to contradict the narrative. For cases like these, dynamic systems are very useful. However, this is not the only distinction we should make when talking about ludonarrative dissonance, because we also have things like involuntary dissonance, in which, for example, you're playing Doom and they tell you, wow, man, you're the best at this and you're just shooting like monsters down, you're amazing. And then the player looks back at what their last 30 minutes of extreme frustration has been, and they're like, ah, yes, I am a super soldier. Yeah. And then again, Doom, it's not exactly a game that people play to have a very immersive narrative experience, but for the case, the example I think is quite understandable. So, more principles of interactivity, of narrative, in interactive narrative. Spatial emotionality. So, a very common thing that interactive narrative has in comparison with classical narratives is that you don't really have as much control, right? So you have cases in which you don't really know what pacing the player has been following, if the game is more difficult than you were expecting for them, or if what tone they are experiencing, because maybe they just came into the game after watching 30 minutes of cute cats getting like doing stupid things as you do, right? And they are like not prepared for a high emotional drama moment, or maybe they have not gotten to see a certain part of the narrative, so they don't really have the context to experience something. There's a lot of things that can go unexpectedly wrong when you're setting up a climax. So a thing that you can do within this interactive context is to just focalize the emotional content towards the environment that the player is in, right? So, for example, Titan Souls is a well. This game actually does have it has lore, which yeah, it's kind of narrative, but like people don't play this game as if it has narrative. However, the emotionality that the setup has, especially the music, the ambience of the music is absolutely stellar in this game. But also the level design, the vast distances that you have to travel to reach each of the titans. It really depicts an emotionality that informs the setup. Another example that I think is much more commonly known is again from Dark Souls, because as I said, I am very resourceful in my references. So for example, in Blighttown, once you discover the actual narrative that's going on with it, with the fair lady and everything, just the being in Blighttown itself carries emotional weight, because it is referencing something of the narrative. It is in itself, it is an emotional piece of the experience. Another one, tension alignment. Well, this is another very simple one. Well, the player can only feel in a certain way because we are only one person with one set of feelings at the same time. But as designers, we can make the distinction between what is the tension of the gameplay and the tension of the narrative. And so we can overlap them and combine them to work appropriately. So basically what I'm saying is just don't mess your pacing, okay? In narrative, we usually consider pacing, and like I said, video games is a bit more iffy because you don't have as much control. But in narrative, you usually consider how you want to be presenting information, how you want the player or the spectator to be feeling when you're presenting that. And in level design, for example, you're considering how each challenge affects the player and how you escalate it and everything. However, you have to account for how those two things relate and overlap with each other, right? And an example for that would be this clip. Now, this is somewhat justified because this is sort of the tutorial, so the player is like figuring things out. And I'm gonna leave the clip because it's relatively long. These all like happens automatically, the fight. The only inputs the player is doing is when you see the icons below, like turning gray. Those are and the blue circles too. But generally, what I'm trying to convey is that there's not a lot of interactive tension in this moment. Yet, when this all finishes, when the whole cinematic ends, the player is like, the characters are all like, oh man, that was a close one. It's like, well, I mean, again, start of the game, the player is coming into the tutorial, they don't even know what they are doing. But if we have this kind of dissociations between how we're presenting narrative and interactivity and how the player should be feeling at each moment, it's not very good. On the other hand, if we manage to overlap the tensions that we're presenting between both parts, it's going to make an even higher climax. Because again, I talk about spatial emotionality, and you should use that, but that doesn't mean that you cannot use climaxes. When using those, consider tension alignment. Okay, I think this is the last one. So emotional correspondence. Oddly enough, when we play, we feel things. Crazy. That is a good base to start building narrative attachment. So we're going to make a consideration here. Anything you are attached to, we can consider it is emotional attachment. However, when you're playing, when you develop attachment because of interactivity, you're simply developing a utilitarian attachment. Even if you're controlling a character, essentially what you're doing is the same attachment you get for a weapon or a tool. And that's perfectly valid, don't get me wrong. But if you want to have narrative drama, if you want to have the spicy gray zone of how we should react as human beings, it's much more interesting to have narrative attachment. So, we can control how we generate narrative attachment by how it feels to interact with or by interacting as a certain character. An example we could give for this would be Titania from Fire Emblem. So in this franchise, there's usually an archetype called the Jagan, which is an early unit that is basically busted, and Titania falls into this archetype. So it's very easy that when you're starting, you're not really sure what you're doing, and your units, honestly, most of the times kind of suck. Having a strong unit that you can just put in the middle of the front lines and let them deal with everything, it usually is a figure that really warms your heart, right? So it's very easy that around chapter 4 or 5, I'm not sure when the story starts getting serious, you have developed a certain attachment to Titania. And the thing is that by the time the story starts getting serious, they start giving her an actual personality and a background. And, you know, it's not a lot because it's Fire Emblem, but it still is sufficient to create drama. And it goes from being a useful unit to being a useful character. This can be done in the reverse way. For example, Nino, as you can clearly see, is a child. And this being Fire Emblem, having a child in your barracks means that you make them fight, or not. But if you use them, it means exactly that. And when she starts, well, she's not very good at that. And it's very easy to look at Nino and be like, ah, she's so bad, and be frustrated, and to sort of, generate this friction. But this friction, ultimately, what it means is an empathy for a character that is clearly not prepared to be in this kind of situation, and yet is being forced to being part of it. So, and again, I chose Nino because even though there are a lot of such cases in Fire Emblem, in Fire Emblem 7 they decided to put a bit more emphasis into this character, and so this effect is much more magnified, because again there is a narrative foothold from which to start. It's not just the action of interactive attachment working here. Oh no, we had one left. Well, sure, we're gonna talk about narrative masking. Basically it means that if we have a world that is just some plain generic models or textures, whatever, and 3 or 4 very clearly distinct spots or characters or agents, well, the player already knows where to go. So narrative masking is the idea that we can dress the world into a certain aspect that allows us to conceal any key points of interaction. So, examples. In Hollow Knight, there's the Mantis culture. Once you've beaten the boss, well, the Mantises become very respectful towards you, because you have been considered this warrior. In Deltarune, there's a character called Reina, who has a lot of paintings of herself, because she is narcissistic and kind of crazy, honestly, which also explains why the paintings shoot fire. Again, Toby Fox could have just have done normal paintings, but he was like, oh no, wait, let me characterize through the environment. And again, those things are not really interactable or don't really hold a lot of narrative weight, but they are a way to make not only the world feel more vivid, but to facilitate the initiative of the player. We're not telling the player what to do by having only interactable elements on the world, but instead we're filling the world with contents, with ideas, with context, characterization, things that make the world grab the attention of the player and make them consider the world, and not just, like I said, having the same elements all being interactable and just taking away any kind of agency. So, with that done, now we have viewed some, not all, some of the considerations, the principles that we should take into account when designing narrative in an interactive space. So with that being said, a bit of a closing statement. And now I'm gonna blow your mind, but like, video games are not films, right? We have to consider something that is as key and vital to the medium and how we perceive information as it is interactivity. But then again, not all video games have to be Fallout New Vegas, okay? It's fine to have the most basic static narrative. It's all about what experience you want to deliver and what tools better serve the process of developing such experience. Another thing, high integration. Like we've said that yes, a narrative in an interactive context is going to have you take into consideration interactive principles, right? But the thing of high integration is that the narrative has become interactivity. So a lot of the design principles that we use when thinking about mechanics, about dynamics design, about system design, all those things mostly still apply to narrative, because essentially narrative design is just interactive design, but considering that we have to work with human elements instead of elements of gameplay, right? And so finally, of course, good luck with implementation. Like I said, this is purely a conceptual overview, and in the end, if you're not able to organize the way in which you approach development, knowing all of these ends up meaning nothing, because development is convoluted. But nonetheless, I hope that this has been useful enough to understand at least the basis of what interactive narrative is, and more importantly, what is the core behind interactive narrative. Why do we have to consider it as a discipline of its own? And well, that would be everything.